11th of June, 10th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Sermon on Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13 and 18 to 26. The account from our Gospel passage concerning the healing of a woman with a hemorrhage illustrates exactly the point Jesus was making in the incident of the call of Matthew to be his disciple. Let's look at that account first. Matthew was a tax collector, that most despised category of men in the first century of Israel. Tax collectors worked for the Roman government, the occupying force, and so they were seen as collaborators, traitors even. The system was that individuals bought the privilege of collecting taxes for the Romans, and they were allowed to collect more than was due from each individual. That's how they were funded. It's how they earned their living. The problem was that many demanded far more than their due, and some became very rich as a result. They were generally hated and viewed even as unclean because they worked for Gentiles. And so when Jesus called a tax collector to follow him, it would have caused amazement. Even worse, Jesus accepted an invitation to eat at Matthew's house, and many other tax collectors and sinners came. Jews would not usually eat with anyone whom they judged to be sinners, and would not even enter their homes. The Pharisees in particular questioned the disciples of Jesus as to why he ate with tax collectors and sinners. It seems strange for any human to judge others as sinners, because we're all sinners. None of us is perfect, and most of us are only too aware of the ways in which we fall short. However, the Pharisees relied on their keeping of the law to render them righteous. They probably felt they were above reproach because they observed the law rigorously, even adding rules of their own. The law of Moses was a very strict code. There were rules that governed the most minute details of one's life, and many must have been difficult for ordinary people to keep. The rules regarding personal hygiene were particularly restrictive. A woman who was menstruating or bleeding for some other reason was considered unclean for the whole duration. The law declared that anyone who touched her would be unclean. Anything she lay on would be unclean. Anything she sat on would be unclean. Anyone who touched her bed or what she sat on would be unclean and must wash his clothes and bathe with water and be unclean for the rest of the day. It doesn't take much imagination to realize how very difficult that would be to implement, especially in a crowded household where there might be only one room. No doubt the Pharisees, who were very wealthy, would have little trouble, and none of them was a woman anyway. But for normal households, it would have been almost impossible. So this puts into sharp focus the story of the woman with a hemorrhage. She hadn't been bleeding just for a few days. She'd been bleeding for 12 years. It must have caused her to almost become a recluse, shunned by all who knew her, excluded from normal activities and even from worship at the synagogue. It must have been sheer desperation that caused her to join the crowd around Jesus and audaciously reach out and touch his cloak. She was far too used to being rebuffed to risk speaking to him and asking for healing. But she thought, if I only touch his cloak, I will be healed. And she was. Jesus stopped in his tracks and spoke to her. There are only a few words recorded in the scriptures, but what words of love and restoration. Take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you. He called her daughter, confirming her as a member of the Jewish community, and commended her faith. Not one word of reproach for breaking the law, mingling with a crowd and touching a man. But we can be certain that he spent some precious time with her, not dismissing her until she felt fully accepted, healed and restored. There was a problem, though. Jesus had actually been on the way with a very important man to heal his sick daughter. Jairus was the ruler of the synagogue. He'd probably spent the last 12 years, the lifetime of his little girl, keeping the woman with the hemorrhage out of his synagogue. And now she was holding up Jesus on his desperate mission. Didn't Jesus know how important he was? Far more important than an unclean woman who was breaking the rules. Jesus, however, didn't judge people in that way. He saw them all as equal. Sinners, yes, but sinners he'd come to save, whether they were important or humble, careful law-keepers or not. He'd spent time with the woman. Now his attention was all for the ruler of the synagogue and his daughter. The delay seems to have been catastrophic, though. The girl had died. The mourners and the flute players were out in force. However, death was no obstacle for Jesus. She's only asleep, he said, and just like waking a sleeping child, he brought her back to life. Jesus had told the Pharisees that he hadn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. If any had been perfect, they would not have needed Jesus' ministry, just as those who are well do not need a doctor. But no one was perfect, not even the Pharisees, who were certain that they were righteous. Everyone needed Jesus. It was a pity that some thought they were too perfect to need his help. In answering the Pharisees, Jesus quoted scripture to them. They had studied the scriptures carefully, but they didn't always learn from them. Jesus recalled to them the words of the Lord through the prophet Hosea to faithless Israel. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, an acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. God didn't want token worship or slavish adherence to rules at the expense of common humanity, kindness and compassion. That was where the law-observing Pharisees failed. Go and learn what this scripture means, Jesus said to them. Of course, we can read this account and think it doesn't apply to us. We don't have any problem with tax collectors, and we're not under the law, as were the Jews. However, we must learn from these scriptures. Are there people whom we despise and seek to exclude in the way that the Pharisees judge tax collectors? Are there some who would not be welcome in our churches? And although we don't worry about the law, do we sometimes scour the Bible for verses that justify our attitudes towards others? Do we sometimes disregard those passages that tell us to be merciful, not to judge, to reach out to the poor and lost? May we truly learn from the scriptures and ensure that we do not follow in the footsteps of the Pharisees, whose pride and self-righteousness caused them ultimately to reject their own Messiah.